In Essential Task 5.1, we are going to transition into a brand new unit. In this unit, we are going to talk about three seemingly unrelated topics: stress, emotion, and motivation. We're going to start with stress. That is the entirety of the 5.1 Essential Task. In Essential Tasks 5.2 and 5.3, we're going to talk about motivation. And then in Essential Task 5.4, we're going to talk about emotion. These are, in fact, somewhat unrelated to each other, but they're three topics that all necessitate at least a concept map or longer. And we group them together sort of into this shorter unit. So in Unit 5, we're only going to be talking about 4 different essential tasks: stress, 2 on motivation, and then 1 on emotion. We're going to start with Essential Task 5.1, introducing stress. We're going to talk about sources of stress, and then different types of stress, and then ultimately some of the conflicts and underlying factors related to stress. The concept map includes the definition of stress, what's called general adaptation syndrome, which is the most readily accepted theory explaining our response to stress, and then talk about a couple things which have underlying effects related to stress: conflicts, and then type A versus type B personality. This concept map, I recommend a horizontal piece of paper. As you saw, it includes not only the definition of stress, but a secondary level that I think necessitates the amount of space offered by a horizontal piece of paper. You can pause the video here, though, copy down the yellow portion. We'll start first by defining stress. So we'll start at the top, as we typically do. Your interpretation and prior knowledge related to stress is largely correct. How you perceive and respond to what are called stressors in your environment, and specifically stressors that you appraise and evaluate as threatening, is precisely what we're talking about. So whether that's an upcoming exam or something big picture like preparing for your college applications, those are both classified as stressors. What's important, though, is that there is a difference between the stress that you experience walking into a one-off singular chemistry exam, and then the type of stress that you may or may not be experiencing as your college decisions loom on the horizon. That one-off, what we call episodic stress, is what's called acute stress. Singular events, you typically know when they're going to end. They have sort of a singular date attached to them: the day of a test, the day of a big exam, the day of a job interview. And you encounter those stressors, you appropriately deal with those stressors, hopefully in an ideal manner, and then you kind of move on with life. For example, whenever I watch sort of big sporting events, whether it's a Super Bowl or a championship game, those singular 2 or 3 hours are in and of themselves quite stressful, but I do know that eventually it's going to end. There will be a definitive outcome, win or loss. What's a little bit different, though, is prolonged stress, what we call chronic stress. Chronic stress is largely what you've experienced in your academic career in high school, and potentially what you'll experience in college, and potentially what you'll then eventually experience when you're a working professional, meaning there is a somewhat definitive timeline, but it's certainly long-lasting. Like, for example, high school is 4 years. Like, yes, you theoretically know that at the end of 4 years you're going to graduate, but that day in and day out grind of getting new assignments and all of these different curveballs being thrown your way isn't quite an acute stress. It's what we call chronic stress. The same is likely going to happen when you make it to college, where, yeah, theoretically it'll take 4 or 5 years to graduate, but it's so prolonged. Every single day there's a new curveball thrown at you. We end up calling that chronic stress. And then, yeah, technically when you start your career, in the back of your mind, you can think to yourself, oh, I'll eventually retire at 65, but that's so far away. That end date's not really well defined. That day in and day out grind of having these new assignments thrown at you, that's what we call chronic stress, because it's seemingly never ending. Maybe one day when you're a parent, you'll experience that prolonged chronic stress. You have children, and certainly you're going to be a parent for the rest of your life. So those types of unique situations, those prolonged stressors, are what we call chronic stress. And we're going to talk a little bit today about what occurs physiologically with our body when we encounter acute and chronic stress. So we're going to transition now to the bottom left corner. It entails talking about a box here at the top that defines the general adaptation syndrome, and then talking about 3 columns for the 3 phases or stages of general adaptation syndrome. Hans Selye gets a green key psychologist, and he is responsible for identifying and listing the criteria for the 3 distinct phases that we're about to talk about, the 3 phases in the response to stress. Those are alarm, resistance, and exhaustion. Depending on what is going on in your life, depending really primarily on the chronic, prolonged stressors in your life, You might be in differing stages, potentially in either stages 2 or 3. We'll talk a little bit about what each of these stages entails, why some stages can actually be beneficial, and why some stages certainly are not beneficial. So we'll have a better understanding of Cellier's general adaptation syndrome when we transition now and talk about each of these 3 stages. So sort of this secondary level to where we just were. Again, we're going to talk about these 3 stages: phase 1, phase 2, and phase 3. The title of this box is a little bit of a mouthful, but I present it this way because if you were to see this as an FRQ bullet, you would see it written in this manner. It wouldn't just say alarm phase, and it wouldn't just say general adaptation syndrome. It would say sort of this mouthful, alarm phase of general adaptation syndrome. I want you to see it this way so that if you see it as an FRQ bullet, you have that familiarity, that you can easily connect what we are about to talk about in this box with what you would need to write about for an FRQ bullet. The alarm phase of the general adaptation syndrome is that immediate response, typically to a acute individual one-off stressor, meaning a bear walks into the classroom. Well, if that were to happen, that's clearly threatening. You would appraise that as threatening, and your body would then immediately begin to mobilize resources to respond, meaning your body would kick into what's called the fight or flight response. In a later unit, we're going to talk way more in depth about the nervous system, so this is a little bit of a preview of a future topic. But what's called the sympathetic nervous system is the division within the nervous system that is responsible for things like accelerated heart rate, breathing rates, blood pressure, glucose levels, all of the various physiological bodily changes that would occur in the event that a bear would walk into the class. And in many ways, you can feel that. You can feel your heart rate increase, the sweating, and all of those various changes, basically at the snap of a finger. All of those changes are what we call the fight or flight response. Those physiological changes, in addition to things like the secretion of stress hormones like adrenaline, and a term that you might have some familiarity with, from what's called the adrenal glands, are all examples of the changes that your body experiences during the alarm phase. What's important here is this is actually a good thing. You might see the word stress and assume it's always a negative. Well, if a bear were walking into the classroom, you would want your body to begin to reallocate resources. Let's take energy away from digestion. Like, we have to run away from a bear. Digestion can be put on the back burner. Let's get your heart rate up. Let's get your breathing rate up. Make sure oxygen is getting in. Let's put your body into the best condition possible to survive this situation. Well, that's what the alarm phase really does. It is a response to stress, typically sort of that immediate one-off acute stressor that puts your body into the best condition possible to survive and deal with it. This can also occur when the situation is much less tame. Like, for example, if you've ever sat into a classroom and the teacher, next thing you know, assigns an essay, and in the moment you can just feel your body, you can feel the stress, you can feel your heart rate going up, realizing that this new event that you've just experienced is in and of itself threatening. You have to allocate time to write the essay, allocate time to prepare. You are experiencing the alarm phase of the general adaptation syndrome. Before walking into class that day, you are sort of in equilibrium, what we might call homeostasis. You, next thing you know, experience this individual stressor, and your body shifts accordingly. So that alarm phase in and of itself, under dramatic situations like a bear walking into the class, is indeed a good thing. So if you see this as an FRQ bullet, you really should write about it as a desirable, because it is in many ways one of the elements of our response system that puts our body in the best condition possible to deal with the stressor. The second one is actually another desirable element of the stress response. So this might be a little bit surprising, but stress itself is not in and of itself always a bad thing. We hear it, certainly we have experience with it, and we anticipate that stress is a negative. Again, the resistance phase of general adaptation syndrome can, in some cases, actually produce desirable outcomes. So if this is an FRQ bullet, it is one that you should address from a favorable perspective. This is more relevant when we're talking about chronic long-term stress. Resistance is the phase of the general adaptation syndrome where you've been experiencing that prolonged chronic stress, but your body has done a good job stabilizing, meaning when you are stressed, certainly for a prolonged period of time, your body goes through a variety of physiological changes. Certain stress hormones are secreted more frequently. You might have experienced higher blood pressure, but your body has done a decent job coping with the fact that your body has undergone these physiological changes. In many ways, your body has stabilized the fact that you've been living with chronic stress. Like, for example, year 3 of college or your senior year of high school. You have been dealing with stress day in and day out, seemingly nonstop. As a result, it's not inconceivable that many of you watching this video are currently in the resistance phase of general adaptation syndrome. And you can spend years in the resistance phase. This isn't like a 20-minute response to stress per se. This phenomenon can occur for months, years on end. So you could have actually been in the resistance phase of general adaptation syndrome from the moment you walked into high school and might persist all throughout college. And this is desirable. This, in many ways, enables you to maintain that long-term focus. This is your body's mechanism to deal with these chronic stressors by maintaining the physiological changes that may have occurred prior that allow you to maintain that focus and deal with these chronic stressors that you're experiencing, or this prolonged chronic stress that you've been dealing with. The issue, though, is the last phase. The last phase is when things get clearly negative, where if it was an FRQ bullet, you really need to address it from a negative. And that's this final one called exhaustion. So just to reiterate here, the first 2 bullets, typically speaking, desirable, either by allowing you to deal with the bear that walks into the class right now or allowing you to deal with that prolonged chronic stress that you've been dealing with in phase 2. Phase 3, exhaustion, is clearly a negative. This is when your body simply can no longer cope with the prolonged chronic stress that you've been dealing with, where those physiological changes such as increased blood pressure finally catch up to you, whether it's sleep deprivation, high blood pressure, whatever it might be. And your body simply gets to the point where the immune system is weakened. You might potentially get sick. You're certainly more vulnerable to disease and the flu, colds. You might collapse. Or if you want to be dramatic in an FRQ, you can technically make the person die in the scenario, just completely die. This is the term that explains why some people, when they feel really stressed, might end up getting sick. Well, that exhaustion phase of general adaptation syndrome opens you up to that vulnerability. And as a result, you might end up getting sick, typically when you're really stressed out. Well, unfortunately, you've reached the last phase of the stress response. If you see this as an FRQ bullet, again, you always address it from a negative perspective. It's always going to hurt someone, whether that's in school, whether that's applying for a job, etc. And you need to be very clear to give a specific example. Throughout all of the AP Psych's history, you can't just say the person is exhausted. Like, technically, the person will probably be exhausted, but because the name exhaustion phase has exhaustion in it, they won't score that as an example. You really need to say the person in the prompt literally collapses and dies because of their stress, because they've been dealing with it so long. Well, that's very clear example of why stress, and specifically the exhaustion phase, is going to hurt you. If the person in the prompt dies, obviously they can't finish college or do whatever it is that they're doing. So you need to be very clear. Exhaustion isn't enough of an example. They have not scored that in the past. You need to be vivid. So whether you want to be really dramatic and say the person dies, or honestly just say they've been dealing with stress so long they get sick and therefore cannot finish their schooling, that would clearly work. That would be a satisfactory answer. So be wary of that. I know it says exhaustion in the name, but you can't really use exhaustion as an example, although it is typically what you would anticipate for somebody exhibiting this phase. The last 2 elements of today's concept map are to talk about some of the underlying life experiences that one could have that might facilitate stress. So whether this is an acute stressor or a chronic stressor, some of the underlying factors which might elicit a stress response. The first is when we experience a conflict. A conflict occurs when we experience a situation where we have incompatible or contrasting demands and goals, somewhat similar to the term cognitive dissonance back from social psychology. It doesn't quite fit the same premise. With cognitive dissonance, we experience the incompatible demands or goals or beliefs, but also try to reduce them. That reduction part's not clearly evident here. This is just sort of on the surface. We are in the middle of an event. Clearly, our goals are incompatible. We can't do both. That might, in and of itself, be an underlying cause of stress. So these conflicts might translate into stress. The first is actually what we call approach conflict, and that's not a typo. It would be written as approach/approach. This is when we have to choose between 2 things that are actually desirable, 2 things we would really like. Many of you might be experiencing approach conflicts right now when deciding where to go to college. If there are two colleges that you equally like, you might actually be experiencing legitimate stress because you can't decide between two appealing, desirable possibilities. This is what we call approach conflict. So whether it's two colleges, maybe even just simply two offerings at a restaurant, two dishes that you really want to try. For anyone who's had to make a decision between all good options, you know that can be quite stressful. The second one is what we call the avoidance conflict. This picture might be a little outdated at this point, but there were many people back in 2016 who viewed both of those presidential candidates as undesirable or unfavorable candidates. If you are in a position where you have to decide between two undesirables, there was nobody else on earth who was going to become president as a result of the 2016 election besides Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. If you didn't like those options, but you still ended up voting for one, that would be an avoidance conflict, where you must decide between two options that you really don't like. A simple, innocent example of the avoidance conflict, and this is one that I can relate to. When I was in high school, at the end of the shifts where I worked, you had to either sweep or mop, and I hated both, but you had to do one. Me and whoever I was working with would kind of decide who did what, but I didn't really like either of them. That was an innocent example. That's not going to elicit a stress response, but it in and of itself is a very simple example of the avoidance conflict. Two options, you hate them both, got to pick one. The last one, and this is the most confusing because it does not follow the pattern we've previously established. The first two, approach, and avoidance, pertain to when there's two options. The approach avoidance conflict occurs when there is only one option that you're considering, at least one possibility, and that possibility has desirable qualities and undesirable qualities. So, for example, you might look at a college like Boston College or some other relatively expensive college and decide, I really love the school. It fits everything that I'm looking for, but I can't afford it. I hate the price. That experience of a situation where there's desirable and undesirable qualities is called the approach avoidance conflict. And again, the naming does not follow the previous pattern, because obviously, if you followed the pattern, if it's approach avoidance, that would mean one good and one bad. Like, that doesn't cause conflict. That's not stressful. Obviously, you pick the good option. So again, the pattern does not apply with the naming. Approach avoidance conflict is when one situation has good and bad, and then you ultimately need to weigh which side is more important to you or which side has more merit. Another situation which might elicit certainly at least the alarm phase, it might not elicit the full-blown stress response, so we're not likely going to go through alarm to resistance to exhaustion based on this, but what we call the frustration aggression principle is a phenomenon that can occasionally occur that definitely gets the alarm phase going, definitely gets that fight or flight response that we briefly alluded to earlier. By definition, frustration is when you fail to achieve a goal. So if you're playing a video game and you fail to complete the level, you're frustrated. If you're at school and you fail to get a question right, when you're sitting there messing around with your calculator trying to figure it out and you can't, you're frustrated. You're in chemistry class, you can't balance the stoichiometry equations that you're doing, you're frustrated. Anytime you want to do something and you can't, the definition of that would be frustration. Frustration, generally speaking, can lead to what we call aggression, meaning some type of behavior, whether it's an actual physical behavior or verbal behavior that intends to kind of destroy or demean. Typically, that's correlated with testosterone, the hormone. The frustration aggression principle is a good example of a phenomenon that could occur that triggers the early phase of the stress response. All the way to the right, so the final box entails talking about two terms that you may have heard before, type A versus type B personality. It's not inconceivable that you've heard these before. Friedman and Rosenman conducted a study. Their names are not important. We're not even going to give them a key psychologist icon or contributing psychologist icon, because the bulk of the importance here is the difference between type A and type B personality. So these individuals conducted what's called a longitudinal study. We're not going to formally define that term for another couple units, but just to preview, a longitudinal study means you take participants, you survey them, question them, and you follow up with them periodically over a course of a period of time, and you continue to ask them the same questions or similar questions, related questions. You basically just follow up with them. Well, Friedman and Rosenman conducted a study where they had 3,000 participants, and for 9 years straight, they followed up with them. And they asked those participants individual questions, sort of in personality inventories where they asked them about their personality, but sort of just big picture things. And they also looked at their health. And what they found is that the individuals that were incredibly type A or incredibly type B had very different ultimate outcomes after 9 years. Type A individuals were people who were clearly hardworking, competitive, aggressive, sometimes impatient, more anger prone. These are the type of people who are sort of always on the go at work, always striving to finish things, always pushing for perfection. And then there were also participants within the study that were really type B, who they might care about their job, certainly care about school, but they're way more easygoing about it. Like, okay, we are dealing with a problem, we're working short-staffed tonight, big deal, we'll figure it out. Two very contrasting sort of personality profiles, very type A and very type B. And what's fascinating is after 9 years, when you check the health records of these people, the individuals who were classified as type A had way more of the cardiovascular issues. 70% of the heart attacks occurred from people who were type A. So whether it was cardiovascular disease or heart attacks, individuals who lived with this type A profile, always being on the go and not hardworking, but sometimes impatient and anger prone, had way, way more of those health consequences than people who were type B. And it's not inconceivable, now we're jumping to some conclusions, but it's not inconceivable that when you take this back all the way to the general adaptation syndrome, that yes, everybody experiences stress, but people who are type A might actually have reached this exhaustion phase more commonly, which then, of course, begins to compromise their health.